hurt you, and destroys you. The words hit Emmeline like a physical blow, the simple truth of them, that her silence had never been about strength or dignity, but about protecting her mother and Edmund and everyone else from the inconvenience of her pain, about making their cruelty easier by absorbing it quietly, by dying silently so they could maintain the fiction that everything was fine, that she was content, that the arrangement was working perfectly. Frederick was watching her face again, reading something there, and he signed slowly so she could follow. Start by making sound. Scream if you need to. We will not hear it, but we will see it, and we will celebrate it. Give yourself permission to be loud, to take up space, to exist fully, rather than diminishing yourself to fit into spaces too small for human souls. Emmeline looked around the bright room, at all these people who had been labelled defective and afflicted and disabled by the hearing world, but who seemed more free, more alive, more fully themselves than anyone she had ever known in Mayfair's drawing rooms, and something inside her cracked open, some final barrier between the woman she had been forced to be and the woman she actually was, and she opened her mouth and screamed. The sound that emerged was raw and primal, years of suppressed rage and grief and terror pouring out in one long wail that went on until her throat was raw and her chest ached and she had no breath left. And when she finally stopped, gasping and shaking, she looked around expecting horror or disapproval or at minimum discomfort, but instead she saw smiling faces, saw people stamping their feet in the deaf version of applause, saw children laughing not at her but with joy for her, saw Beatrice nodding with approval, saw Frederick watching her with such pride and tenderness that it made her want to cry again, but differently this time, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, of being heard without sound, of being celebrated rather than silenced. The vibration of all those stamping feet travelled through the floorboards, a physical sensation that Emmeline could feel in her bones. This was how deaf people applauded, how they showed approval and joy, through movement and vibration rather than sound. And Emmeline felt that vibration enter her body and shake loose something that had been stuck for so long she had forgotten it was there, some essential part of herself that she had buried to survive her mother's training, her society's expectations, her fiancé's contempt. Beatrice approached and pulled Emmeline into an embrace. No polite air kiss or formal handshake, but a real hug, fierce and warm, and when she pulled back, she signed, "Welcome to the world of the living. You have been dead for a long time, but you are waking up now. Stay awake. Do not let them put you back to sleep." The rest of the visit passed in a blur of new experiences. Emmeline sat in on a lesson where deaf children were learning to read and write in English, their hands moving in complex grammatical discussions that would have put most hearing students to shame. She watched older students practicing their trades, bookbinding and carpentry and tailoring, learning skills that would allow them to support themselves in a world that often refused to employ deaf workers. She met teachers and parents and community members who had built a whole society within London that operated by different rules, valued different things, celebrated what the hearing world called disability as simply difference. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the tall windows, Frederick touched her arm gently to indicate it was time to leave, and Emmeline felt a pang of grief at having to return to the other world, the world of silence and suppression, of propriety and performance, of slow death disguised as duty. She signed her goodbyes to Beatrice and the children, her hands moving more fluently now after hours of practice and immersion, and Beatrice signed back, "Remember, freedom is a choice. You must choose it every day, sometimes many times a day. It is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is something you practice, something you fight for, something you claim over and over again against all the forces that want to put you back in your cage. Your Duke understands this. Trust him. Trust yourself. Trust that you deserve more than silent suffering. In the carriage on the way back to Mayfair, Emmeline and Frederick sat side by side in the growing twilight, and he wrote in his notebook, "Are you sorry you came? Was it too much?" She took the pencil and wrote back, "I am not sorry. I am grateful, and also terrified, because now I know what freedom looks like, and I understand how thoroughly imprisoned I have been, and I do not know how to go back to my mother's house and pretend that I have not seen another way to live. I do not know how to marry Edmund in less than 2 weeks, knowing that I am choosing a cage when I could choose something different. I do not know how to unknow what I now know." Frederick read her words and wrote, "You do not have to unknow it. You do not have to pretend. You do not have to marry him. I know it seems impossible. I know there are debts and expectations and 100 practical reasons why refusal feels out of reach. But I am telling you, as someone who has lived through the death of one life and the birth of another, as someone who thought losing his hearing was the end of everything, and discovered it was actually the beginning of truth, that you have more power than you believe, more options than you can currently see, more people willing to help than you imagine." She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that she could simply refuse to marry Edmund, could walk away from the engagement and survive the consequences. But the practical realities seemed insurmountable, even more so now that she had glimpsed freedom and understood what she would be losing if she surrendered to the marriage her mother had arranged. The loss seemed bigger now, more devastating, because she knew exactly what she was giving up, not just some vague, abstract idea of happiness, but this specific, vivid experience of being fully alive, fully herself, fully expressed without apology or diminishment. The carriage rolled through the streets of London, leaving Bermondsey behind and returning to Mayfair, to gaslit squares and fashionable townhouses, to the world of whispered cruelties and polite fictions. And with each turn of the wheels, Emmeline felt the weight of her old life settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar coat, heavy and confining, but known, predictable, safe in its very imprisonment. And she understood what Beatrice had meant about choosing freedom every day, about how it was not a single dramatic decision, but 1,000 small choices to stay awake, to remain free, to refuse the comfortable numbness of the cage, even when the cage seemed easier than the terrifying openness of liberation. The library door had been open perhaps 3 inches, enough for the upstairs maid to see through as she passed on her way to turn down the beds for the evening, enough to witness Lady Emmeline Dashwood sitting shoulder to shoulder with the Duke of Wentworth in the window alcove, their hands moving in strange gestures, their faces closer together than propriety strictly allowed, his fingers resting against her throat in a gesture that looked disturbingly intimate, even if the maid could not understand its purpose. And though the girl was not naturally inclined to tale-bearing, the housekeeper had made it clear that any unusual behavior from Miss Emmeline in these final days before her wedding should be reported immediately to Lady Catherine, who was determined that nothing should threaten this advantageous match that would save the family from complete financial ruin. Lady Catherine received the report with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been satisfaction, her thin fingers drumming on the arm of her chair as she considered the implications of her daughter spending dawn hours in private meetings with a duke, even a damaged one, even one whose deafness made him unsuitable as a husband for a woman of Emmeline's station, given that he could provide no real social advancement and came with the embarrassment of his disability. Still, a duke's attention was notable, was something that could be mentioned in conversation, was proof that Emmeline possessed some quality worth noticing, even if she was plain and too serious, and entirely too interested in inappropriate subjects. For 3 days, Lady Catherine said nothing, merely watched as Emmeline continued to rise before dawn and disappear into the library. As she returned to breakfast with a lightness in her step that had not been there before, as she smiled at nothing in particular, and seemed to exist in some private world that excluded her mother entirely. And Lady Catherine felt the stirrings of unease, the sense that something was shifting in her carefully controlled household, that her daughter was slipping away from her grasp in ways that threatened the marriage arrangement that was the only thing standing between the Dashwood family and complete social and financial collapse. On the 4th day, Lady Catherine positioned herself outside the library door at dawn, waiting in the shadows of the hallway, and when Frederick Wentworth arrived precisely at sunrise and entered without knocking, she gave him 5 minutes before following, opening the door silently to observe the scene within. Her daughter and this duke sitting so close their thighs touched, writing notes to each other and laughing without sound, his hand covering hers on the table in a gesture of casual intimacy that no unmarried couple should share. And Lady Catherine felt cold rage spreading through her chest because she recognized that expression on her daughter's face, had seen it once before in a mirror many years ago when she herself had been young and foolish enough to believe in love, before she learned that such feelings were luxuries that women in precarious financial positions could not afford. She entered the library with the deliberate tread of judgment itself, and Emmeline looked up with an expression that moved from joy to terror in the space of a heartbeat, her hand jerking away from Frederick's as though burned, her body instinctively curling inward in a posture of defense that spoke of long experience with her mother's anger. And Frederick rose slowly to his feet, his grey eyes moving between mother and daughter, reading the situation with that uncanny perception that allowed him to see what hearing people missed, understanding immediately that he had caused trouble for Emmeline simply by existing in her world. Lady Catherine did not acknowledge Frederick beyond a curt nod, her attention fixed entirely on her daughter, her voice low and venomous in a way that made Emmeline flinch. "Your wedding is in 1 week, and I find you entertaining a gentleman in private without chaperone or propriety. Explain yourself immediately." Emmeline opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, the words dying in her throat as they always did when confronted with her mother's fury, and she felt the familiar paralysis settling over her, the trained response of silence and submission. But then she felt Frederick's hand on her shoulder, a gentle pressure that somehow gave her courage, and she managed to whisper, "We were only reading, Mother, discussing books." Nothing improper occurred. Lady Catherine's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Reading," she repeated, her tone making it sound like an accusation. "You expect me to believe that you rise before dawn to read with a duke who cannot even hear you? Do not insult my intelligence, Emmeline. I may not know what happens in this room, but I know the look on your face. I know what affection looks like, and I will not allow you to jeopardize this marriage with some foolish romantic notion about a damaged man who can offer you nothing but social embarrassment and financial uncertainty." Frederick had been reading Lady Catherine's lips, and he wrote quickly in his notebook before holding it up for her to see, "I have offered Lady Emmeline nothing but friendship and intellectual conversation. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should examine what kind of marriage you are forcing her into, that it cannot survive her having a friend." Lady Catherine snatched the notebook from his hands, read it, and threw it back at him with a fury that made Emmeline gasp. "How dare you speak to me of what I am forcing? You know nothing of our circumstances, nothing of the debts that hang over this family like a sword, nothing of the sacrifices required to maintain our position in society. My daughter will marry Viscount Whitmore in 1 week as planned, and you will cease these inappropriate meetings immediately, or I will ensure that every drawing-room in London knows that the deaf Duke of Wentworth has been pursuing an engaged woman, destroying both her reputation and yours." Frederick held Lady Catherine's gaze steadily, unflinching, and wrote again. You cannot destroy what I do not value. I care nothing for society's opinion. But Emmeline does, or has been taught to, so I will honor her wishes. If she asks me to leave, I will leave. If she asks me to stay, I will stay. The choice is hers, not yours. The suggestion that Emmeline had any choice in the matter seemed to enrage Lady Catherine beyond measure, and she grabbed her daughter's arm with bruising force, dragging her toward the door while Emmeline stumbled and tried to pull away, tried to look back at Frederick, tried to say something, anything, but her voice had abandoned her again, had retreated into the learned silence of 26 years, and she allowed herself to be pulled from the library like a child, like property, like something with no will of its own. Lady Catherine marched Emmeline directly to her bedroom and shoved her inside with enough force that she stumbled and nearly fell, and then her mother followed her in, closing the door behind them with a finality that made Emmeline's heart sink. You will remain in this room until your wedding day, Lady Catherine announced, her voice ice-cold. I will have meals brought to you. I will allow your maid to attend you, but you will see no one else, speak to no one else, and certainly you will not continue these disgraceful meetings with the Duke. I had thought, perhaps, his attention might be useful, might add some prestige to your marriage, but I see now that you have developed feelings for him, feelings that could threaten everything I have worked to secure, and I will not allow it. Emmeline found her voice, finally, small and desperate. Mother, please, I have done nothing wrong. We only talked, only read together. I swear nothing improper occurred. Lady Catherine's expression was pitiless. The impropriety is in your heart, Emmeline. I can see it in your face. You look at him the way I once looked at someone, and I learned at great cost that such feelings are worthless when set against practical necessity. Your father left us with debts that will destroy us if this marriage does not proceed. Do you understand? We will lose this house, our position, everything. We will be cast out into genteel poverty, unable to show our faces in society, and all because you developed a childish infatuation with a man who cannot even hear you. The words struck Emmeline like physical blows, and she felt tears beginning to stream down her face, silent as always. But her mother saw them and showed no sympathy. Tears will not change the reality of our situation, she said coldly. You will marry Edmund Whitmore. You will be a dutiful wife, and you will forget this foolish notion that you deserve anything more than security and respectability. Love is a luxury we cannot afford, and the sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be. For the next 3 days, Emmeline remained locked in her room, her meals brought by her maid Clara, a young woman of perhaps 20, who had always shown her kindness, who now looked at her with such pity that it made Emmeline want to scream, but she remained silent, sat by her window looking out at the square below, watching the world continue as though nothing had changed, as though she had not just lost the one person who had ever truly seen her, who had taught her that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, who had shown her a world where expression was celebrated rather than punished. On the 4th day of her imprisonment, Lady Catherine brought Edmund to visit, announcing his presence with a sharp knock before opening the door and ushering him in, and Emmeline felt her stomach turn at the sight of him, at his smug expression, and the way his eyes travelled over her body in a manner that felt violating even though he had not touched her. Your mother has explained that you have been unwell, Edmund said, his tone suggesting he did not believe this explanation for a moment. She thinks it would be helpful for us to discuss the more practical aspects of our upcoming union, to ensure that you understand what will be expected of you as my wife, particularly in the marital chamber. Emmeline felt her face burning with shame and anger, understanding immediately that this conversation was designed to humiliate her, to remind her of her powerlessness, to break whatever spirit she had managed to reclaim during her meetings with Frederick, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Lady Catherine silenced her with a sharp gesture. "You will listen to your future husband, Emmeline. It is time you understood the realities of marriage. The romantic notions you may have entertained must be set aside in favor of practical understanding of your duties." What followed was the most degrading 15 minutes of Emmeline's life. Edmund describing in crude detail what he expected from her on their wedding night, and thereafter speaking of her body as though it were property he had purchased, discussing his rights and her obligations with a casual cruelty that made her feel sick. While her mother stood by, nodding approval, occasionally interjecting comments about the importance of wifely submission and the natural order of marriage. And through it all, Emmeline sat frozen, silent, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but endure. When Edmund finally finished his lecture, he approached her chair and pulled her roughly to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise. "You understand now what marriage means," he said, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "You belong to me, Emmeline. Your body, your time, your very thoughts belong to me, and you will learn to obey. Silent or not, you will obey." He leaned in to kiss her, and something inside Emmeline finally broke free, some last reserve of self-preservation that had been building since the conservatory, since the engagement party, since she had learned what it felt like to be truly seen and valued by someone like Frederick, and she shoved him away with all her strength, the movement so sudden and unexpected that he stumbled backward, and she heard herself shouting, the word tearing from her throat like something physical being expelled. "No!" Edmund's face darkened with rage, and before Emmeline could register what was happening, his hand flew out and connected with her cheek with a crack that echoed in the room, the force of the blow sending her reeling sideways, her hand flying to her face where she could already feel heat blooming, the sting of impact spreading across her skin, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. Lady Catherine, hearing the commotion, rushed into the room and took in the scene with one sharp glance, her daughter holding her bleeding mouth, Edmund standing over her with fist still raised, and rather than defending Emmeline or expressing shock at the violence, she turned on her daughter with fury. "Hysterics," she pronounced, as though Emmeline's refusal to be kissed and her subsequent assault were merely symptoms of feminine weakness. "This is exactly the sort of unseemly display I was afraid of. You will not embarrass this family or jeopardize this marriage with your theatrical outbursts." She moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small brown bottle, the laudanum she kept for headaches and nerves, and despite Emmeline's attempts to pull away, to refuse the medicine, Lady Catherine forced several drops between her lips, holding her jaw shut until she swallowed, and within minutes Emmeline felt the drug begin to work, felt her limbs growing heavy, her thoughts turning thick and slow, felt herself sinking into a grey haze where everything seemed distant and unimportant, even the pain in her face, even the terror of what had just happened, even the knowledge that in less than a week she would be married to a man who had just struck her and would have every legal right to do so again, and worse once she became his wife. She was vaguely aware of Edmund leaving, of her mother speaking in low tones about managing her daughter's nerves, of being guided to her bed, where she lay staring at the canopy above her while the room spun gently, and in her drugged state she thought of Frederick, of the way his hands had felt on hers, of the vibration of her laughter against his palm, of the deaf children stamping their feet in approval when she screamed, of Beatrice signing that freedom was a choice that must be made every day, and she understood with terrible clarity that she was choosing the cage, was surrendering to the marriage despite everything she had learned, despite everything Frederick had shown her, because she was too frightened, too conditioned, too convinced of her own powerlessness to fight for anything different. Over the next 2 days, Emmeline remained in a laudanum haze, her mother dosing her regularly to keep her compliant and quiet, and during the brief periods when the drug wore off enough for her to think clearly, she was consumed with self-loathing and despair, understanding that she was betraying herself, betraying Frederick, betraying everything she had glimpsed in that bright room in Bermondsey, where deaf children laughed without shame, and people expressed themselves fully without fear of punishment. On the second day of her drugged imprisonment, Clara brought her dinner tray, and after checking that the hallway was clear, slipped Emmeline a pen and paper. "His Grace has been asking after you," the maid whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "He comes every day to the house, but your mother refuses to see him. He leaves notes, but she burns them. He looks desperate, miss, like a man who has lost something precious. If you wanted to write to him, I could get the letter out. My brother works in the Duke's household. He could deliver it without anyone knowing." Emmeline took the paper with shaking hands, and through the fog of laudanum and despair, she wrote what felt like the only honest thing she could say, the only truth that mattered in this moment, when she understood with perfect clarity that she lacked the courage to save herself. "I am a coward. I cannot be free. Forgive me. Forget me. You showed me another world, but I am too weak to reach for it. I will marry Edmund in 5 days, and I will die slowly in that marriage, and it is my own fault for being unable to choose differently. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I wish I were braver. I wish I were stronger. I wish I were the woman you seemed to think I could be. But I am not. I am exactly what my mother made me, a silent, obedient thing with no will of its own. Please forget you ever knew me. Please do not waste another thought on someone so thoroughly broken. I release you from any obligation you might feel. I free you even as I cannot free myself." She folded the letter and gave it to Clara, who tucked it into her apron and slipped from the room. And Emmeline lay back on her bed, staring at the wedding dress that hung in the corner like a ghost, like a shroud, like the physical manifestation of her future, white and pristine and utterly suffocating, and she let the tears flow silently as they always had, as they always would, because she was returning to the silence she had been briefly freed from, was accepting the cage, even though she now knew exactly what she was surrendering. And the knowledge made it so much worse than the original blind acceptance, made it feel like suicide rather than duty, like choosing death over life, like the ultimate betrayal of everything Frederick had tried to show her about who she could be if she were brave enough to claim it. The laudanum pulled her under again, and she dreamed of stamping feet and flying hands and a room full of people who celebrated expression rather than punishing it. And in her dream, she was screaming, loud and long and free. But when she woke, her throat was raw, and her mother was standing over her with another dose of medicine, and Emmeline understood that even her dreams of freedom would be taken from her, that she would spend the rest of her life in this grey haze of compliance and silence. And she had chosen it herself, had surrendered without a fight, had proven her mother right that she was weak and biddable and entirely unsuited for anything more than silent suffering in service of family duty. And the shame of that recognition was worse than any physical pain, worse than Edmund's slap or her mother's cruelty, because it was the wound she had inflicted on herself, the choice she had made to return to the cage, even when the door had been opened, even when Frederick had stood waiting to help her escape, if only she had been brave enough to walk through. The drawing-room of the Dashwood townhouse had never held such a gathering, such an unlikely assembly of power and purpose that seemed to bend the very air with tension, and Lady Catherine stood near the fireplace with her hand pressed to her throat, her face pale with shock and calculation as she took in the 3 people who had invaded her domain, despite her explicit instructions to the butler that she was not receiving visitors. Frederick Wentworth, Duke of Wentworth, stood in the center of the room with the presence of a man who had learned that physical stature mattered far less than the force of will behind it. his grey eyes blazing with an anger that needed no sound to be perfectly understood, his hands moving in sharp, decisive gestures that spoke volumes to those who could read them, and beside him stood two allies who made refusal of his demands all but impossible. The Duke of Brandon was perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of aristocratic bearing that came from generations of unquestioned authority, and he watched Lady Catherine with cool assessment, a lawyer's mind calculating every possible outcome, every advantage and liability, every pressure point that might be applied to achieve the desired result. Mrs. Beatrice Morland stood on Frederick's other side, her deaf silence somehow more powerful than any spoken words, her presence itself a challenge to the hearing world's assumptions about weakness and disability, and in her hands she held a leather portfolio that Lady Catherine eyed with growing dread. The Duke of Brandon spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority and social position. "Lady Catherine, I am here as both friend to the Duke of Wentworth and as a solicitor with information regarding your daughter's engagement to Viscount Edmund Whitmore, information that I believe will significantly alter your perspective on the advisability of this match. May we sit and discuss this matter like civilized people, or must we conduct this conversation standing like adversaries?" Lady Catherine gestured stiffly toward the furniture, her mind racing through possibilities, trying to understand what could have brought a duke and a solicitor to her home, what information they could possibly possess that would concern Emmeline's engagement, but she maintained her composure, lowering herself into a chair with the studied grace of a woman who had spent her life performing dignity even when terrified. Frederick remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of barely contained fury, and Lady Catherine found herself unable to meet his eyes, found something unsettling in the way he watched her, as though he could see through every pretense, every carefully constructed justification for her treatment of Emmeline. The Duke of Brandon opened the leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, laying them on the table between them with deliberate precision. "Over the past week," he began, his tone professionally neutral, at the Duke of Wentworth's request, "I have conducted a thorough investigation into the financial and personal circumstances of Viscount Edmund Whitmore, and what I have discovered is deeply troubling. Lord Whitmore's debts exceed £30,000, accumulated through gambling and reckless speculation. His creditors include several extremely unsavory characters who would not hesitate to employ violence to secure repayment. Furthermore, he maintains an ongoing liaison with a Miss Lydia Hartwell, whom I understand is Lady Emmeline's cousin, and has promised this young woman that he will continue the relationship after his marriage, treating his future wife as merely a financial convenience rather than a true partner." Lady Catherine's face had grown progressively paler during this recitation, but she rallied, attempting to dismiss the information with a wave of her hand. "The financial difficulties of young men are common," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "As for the other matter, I am aware that gentlemen often maintain certain arrangements. It is not ideal, but it is hardly unprecedented. My daughter has been raised to understand the realities of marriage among our class." The Duke of Brandon's expression hardened. "You are aware, then, that Lord Whitmore struck your daughter 3 days ago, that he left visible bruising on her face, that he has expressed his intention to, and I quote from a letter intercepted by my investigators, train her to proper obedience through whatever means necessary once they are married and her person becomes his legal property." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Lady Catherine felt her carefully constructed defences beginning to crumble. But she was not ready to surrender, not when so much depended on this marriage, not when her family's survival hung in the balance. "My daughter provoked him," she said weakly. "She has been difficult, emotional, refusing to accept her responsibilities. A firm hand may be necessary to guide her toward proper wifely behavior." Frederick's hands moved in a gesture so sharp and angry that even Lady Catherine, who could not understand sign language, flinched at the obvious fury in the movement, and Mrs. Morland translated in a clear, cold voice. "The Duke says you are a monster who has tortured your daughter for 26 years and now seek to deliver her to a man who will continue that torture for the rest of her life. He says you do not deserve to be called a mother, that you have failed in every duty a parent owes a child, that you have sacrificed your daughter's happiness, safety, and very soul to preserve your own social standing, and he will not allow it to continue." Lady Catherine drew herself up, attempting to reassert her authority. "The Duke of Wentworth may think whatever he pleases, but he has no authority over my daughter or my household. Emmeline will marry Lord Whitmore in 3 days as planned. We have debts that must be paid, obligations that must be met. His family's settlement is the only thing standing between us and ruin. Whatever your Grace's personal feelings, that is the reality of our situation." The Duke of Brandon smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth. "That brings us to the second part of our business here today. I have also investigated your family's debts, Lady Catherine, and I have taken the liberty of purchasing them, all of them, from your various creditors, which means that the Dashwood family now owes approximately £15,000, not to a collection of merchants and moneylenders, but to me personally, and I am prepared to forgive that debt entirely, to consider it paid in full on one condition." Lady Catherine stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her mind struggling to process this information, to understand what was being offered and what it would cost. "The condition," the Duke of Brandon continued, "is that you immediately release Lady Emmeline from her engagement to Lord Whitmore, that you allow her to make her own choice regarding her future, and that you never again attempt to control her life through financial manipulation or emotional cruelty. If you agree to these terms, your debts disappear, your family retains its home and position, and you lose only the illusion of power over your daughter. If you refuse, I will call in the debts immediately, will pursue legal action for their recovery, and will ensure that every drawing room in London knows that you attempted to force your daughter into marriage with a violent man of questionable character to cover your own financial mismanagement. It was not a choice, but the illusion of one, a trap disguised as an offer, and Lady Catherine understood immediately that she had been outmaneuvered, that Frederick Wentworth had brought forces to bear that she could not hope to resist. But even as she calculated the benefits of surrender, even as she recognized that a duke's protection was worth more than a viscount's settlement, she felt rage at being forced to yield, at losing control over the daughter she had shaped and molded for this exact purpose. "Very well," she said finally, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "I agree to your terms. The engagement to Lord Whitmore is dissolved. You may inform him that I have reconsidered the match, but I fail to see what this achieves beyond leaving my daughter unmarried and without prospects, unless your Grace has some alternative arrangement in mind." Frederick had been watching this exchange with his hand pressed to the table, feeling the vibrations of voices he could not hear, reading lips and body language and all the visual cues that told him the negotiation was proceeding as planned. And now he moved forward, pulling out his own notebook and writing quickly before holding it up for Lady Catherine to read. "I am offering an alternative," he had written in his bold, clear hand. "I am asking Lady Emmeline to marry me instead. I will settle all your family's debts, will provide a generous allowance for your household, will ensure that you maintain your position in society, but in exchange Emmeline becomes my wife, not your possession. She will live as she chooses, express herself as she chooses, and you will have no authority over her ever again. These are my terms. Bring her down so I can ask her myself, so she can choose freely without your interference or manipulation." Lady Catherine stared at the words, her mind spinning through the implications. A duke's offer was infinitely superior to a viscount's. The social elevation alone was worth more than Edmund's settlement had ever been, but she also understood that she was being asked to give up all control, all influence, all the power she had wielded over Emmeline since birth, and the loss felt unbearable even as the gain was undeniable. "She has been unwell," Lady Catherine said carefully, attempting one last manipulation. "She has been taking medicine for her nerves. She may not be in a fit state to make such an important decision." Frederick's expression darkened further, and he wrote again, his pencil pressing so hard into the paper that it tore slightly. "You have been drugging her to keep her compliant. I know this. My investigator spoke with your maid. Bring her down now, or I will go up and get her myself. You no longer have any say in this matter. Your choice is whether to cooperate gracefully or to be exposed as the cruel, controlling woman you are. Decide quickly, because my patience is exhausted." Lady Catherine rose stiffly and moved to the bell-pull, summoning a servant and instructing them to bring Miss Emmeline to the drawing-room immediately, to help her dress if necessary, but to bring her down regardless of her state. And then she returned to her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of barely suppressed rage masked by forced courtesy. The wait seemed eternal, minutes stretching like hours while Frederick paced the room, his movements tight with anxiety, his hands occasionally forming signs that Mrs. Morland responded to with gentle reassurance, and the Duke of Brandon reviewed his documents with the calm of someone confident in the outcome, and Lady Catherine sat rigid and furious, mourning the loss of her power even as she calculated the social advantages of having a duke as a son-in-law. When the door finally opened and Emmeline appeared, supported by her maid Clara, Frederick felt his heart contract painfully at the sight of her. She was still in her nightclothes with a dressing gown thrown over them, her hair loose and tangled, her face pale and slack from the laudanum, her eyes unfocused and confused, and on her cheek, clearly visible even in the afternoon light, was the purple bruise where Edmund had struck her, the mark of violence that made Frederick's hands clench into fists, made him want to find Edmund Whitmore and deliver a much more thorough beating. But he forced himself to remain calm, to focus on Emmeline, to remember that this moment was about her choice, not his anger. Emmeline's eyes found him across the room, and he saw recognition dawn, saw confusion and hope and fear war in her expression, saw her try to speak, but no sound emerge, saw her look to her mother with the automatic response of someone seeking permission, and he moved toward her quickly, crossing the space between them and dropping to his knees before her, so that their eyes were level, so that she could see his face clearly, so that he could communicate directly without the interference of her mother or anyone else. Her hands were shaking as he took them in his own, and he could feel the tremor running through her whole body, could see that she was struggling to focus through the drug haze, and he signed slowly, clearly, forming each word with deliberate precision so she could follow even in her impaired state. "I received your letter," he signed, "and I am here to tell you that you are not a coward, that you are not broken, that you are worthy of freedom and happiness and every good thing this world has to offer. Your mother has agreed to release you from your engagement to Edmund Whitmore. You are free of him, free of that future, but I want to offer you something different, not another cage, but a true choice." He paused, watching her face, seeing the tears beginning to stream down her cheeks, and he continued signing. "Marry me, Emmeline. Marry me, and I will never ask you to be silent. I will never ask you to diminish yourself. I will never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are. I will protect you and support you and help you discover who you might become without the weight of your mother's expectations crushing you. But this is your choice, not a transaction, not a duty, not a sacrifice. If you do not want to marry me, if you would prefer to be free without attaching yourself to another man, I will still pay your family's debts, will still ensure your freedom, will still offer you any help you need to build whatever life you choose. You do not owe me anything. You do not have to accept my proposal. You only have to choose what you want, and whatever that is, I will support it." Emmeline stared at him, her hand still trembling in his grasp, her mind struggling to process what he was offering, what he was asking, whether this was real or some laudanum-induced hallucination, whether she dared to believe that freedom was actually possible, that she could choose